Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. My name is Josh Sussman from the Nefesh Marketing and Program Team. We are very happy to have with us Jane Ullman, who will be presenting this afternoon session. And we will be taking questions on the Q&A, not on the chat, please. Questions will be answered by Yair Givati, who just presented the previous session on buying a home in Israel, and Jane and Yair have now flip-flopped their roles. We will be recording this session and send it out along with the presentation itself, and all contact information will be sent out in the next 24 to 48 hours. Again, please use the Q&A feature on your Zoom, and additionally, we will not be using the raise your hand feature, so you can not do that. Just as a reminder, we have two other real estate related sessions coming up. On December 20th, we have a session dedicated to mortgages. And then as a follow-up to the two sessions this evening and the mortgage session, also on December 20th, we have a open forum Q&A on real estate. We will be able to take all of your questions that come up from this session, any reviewing you do until that point. And with that, I will leave it to Jane to get us going. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hi, I'm Jane Ullman. I'm an attorney in Jerusalem. I've been an attorney for over 20 years. As I said, I have an office in Jerusalem. We specialize in real estate law and inheritances, small businesses, things like that. So I've been asked to discuss with you the process of renting a property in Israel, which is a different process than elsewhere outside of Israel, whether or not you're from Canada, the US, the UK. Israel has its own idiosyncrasies in their process. So what's going to happen is I'm going to go through the process, what the contract will be looking like and what you will be looking for in your contract. And Advocate Yair Givati is going to be answering the questions behind the scenes, any questions that you write into the Q&A. As Josh Sussman said, this will be recorded. So if things seem too quick for you, we apologize in advance. There is a lot of information, but you can always refer to it back recorded, or you can send a question. If the question is not answered during the session, you can also email myself or Yair, and we will endeavor to answer your questions by email after the fact. So let's start off with leasing the property. First of all, it really comes up as a question at all why you would need a lawyer to look over a lease, because outside of Israel, it's kind of a standard thing. People have pretty standard leases, and a lot of times people are surprised that a lawyer gets involved at all in leasing your property. First, there are no standard leases in Israel. Most of that stems from the fact that there are no leasing centers, meaning leasing complexes, where all of the apartments in a large building, for instance, are all for rent, and they're all rented out by one owner, by one company, and the management company has a contract. You walk in, you give first and last month's rent, sign the contract, and then you're done. It doesn't work like that in Israel because there aren't any rental complexes. All apartments are individually owned by a specific owner, and he or she would act as your landlord, and they have their own contract. So that means that each person can send out any contract they want, and it can be very individual. Some of the contracts are better than others, we would say, as attorneys, and conform more to the law, but not all contracts do. And even though there are some things that you're not able to write in a contract, even if it's against the law, not everyone knows what the law is. And that's why you would want to make sure that your lawyer is reviewing your contract. Aside even from things that are illegal, there are a lot of things that are legal. They are legal, but they are not things that you would want to have in your contract, or things that you would not have known to look out for, hidden expenses, hidden responsibilities. So for that reason, to really understand what it is that you're getting into as far as a rental contract, it's always worth showing it to an attorney and having them review it and negotiate the terms of that contract for you, because it can be very costly if you make mistakes in that contract. Again, a lot of people, when they start the process, they just feel overwhelmed, and we understand that. How does the process go? The basic tips for success are as follows. One is that you need to lose your expectations. everyone walks in, with their own experience and their own reference, and they think, when in my home country, it works like this. So you need to put that aside as much as possible, and there'll be less chafing at how it's different in Israel, and try to understand how it works here and why things are not necessarily as crazy as they sound, or maybe they are crazy, but that's still the way it works. The next tip that we would have is to know your resources and make use of them. You don't have to fly blind. You should insist on understanding what's in your contract and understanding the process. Anyone that tells you just to sign on the dotted line without trying to explain to you the terms and the pros and the cons of any contract is not in your corner. You need to find someone that's going to be in your corner and explain to you, how does the process work? How much are things going to be costing? What other expenses are there involved in the contract, so that you can make an informed decision? And the third thing is to build yourself that team. In rentals, there's less of a team. Obviously, you're not buying this property, but you definitely may want to make use of a good agent, and you certainly want to make good use of a good lawyer. And it may come to the point where you have a property manager, or the landlord has a property manager, and you need to be able to ask the questions of that property manager as well. So how does a contract look? There are some basic terms in every rental contract. One are the business terms, the clauses having to do with maintenance and repairs, and additional costs and securities. The business terms are basically laid out into three categories. One is the property. Any contract should first of all list what kind of property you're buying, how many rooms are in the apartment. I'll remind you that in Israel, a 3-bedroom apartment would be listed as 4 rooms, because it's always the amount of bedrooms plus the living room or the lounge, and that makes up how many rooms are in the apartment. So a 3-bedroom apartment will be listed as a 4-room apartment, 4-room flat. The second thing that I always look for is proof of the landlord's rights. This is actually unusual as far as due diligence with regards to a lease, because most people just take it at face value and assume that whoever's giving you the lease has the legal right to be signing that lease with you. Unfortunately, I've seen a couple of really bad cases where that person didn't actually have the rights to the property, and the lease therefore was not valid. Even some very scary extreme cases where someone was a con man and had gotten the keys to an apartment and had been showing it to a lot of people pretending to be the owner, took first month's rent, and it turned out that he was just a con man. So you always want to ask for proof of the ownership rights by the landlord, and that's not a crazy thing to ask for. The third thing is, what else is included in the apartment? If you watched the previous webinar with Yair Givati, he would explain to you that apartments are sold in Israel stripped, meaning very little included in the apartment. Rentals often have a little bit more than a stripped apartment, but not necessarily that much more. Oftentimes there are no appliances, or maybe it doesn't have closets. It's certainly not furnished with beds and dressers and things like that unless it's specified. So you want to make sure that in your contract, it specifies if there are any furnishings and what they are. There's a list attached to the end of the contract, which is the contents list. And lastly, what state does the apartment have to be in at the beginning of the lease? Are there any repairs to be made? A standard contract will say that the tenant waives all claim and accepts the apartment in its current state and agrees to rent it in its current state. But what if paint really needs to be repaired, or you can see that the screens are broken, or I don't know, the kitchen cupboards are kind of falling off the hinges? You would want to make sure that it's in the contract that the landlord agrees and undertakes to perform those repairs before the beginning of the lease. The next category is the money. How much is the rent? The monthly amount, whether or not it's linked to the CPI, known as the Madad, or the index in Israel, especially in longer term leases, more than a year, 2, 3 years. Some landlords like to link that amount so that they feel that they can make sure that the currency is preserved, the amount of the currency. It's my preference as an attorney representing tenants to try to always strike that clause out of the contract, and you would like to have your rent not be linked to the index. But if it has to be, then make sure that you're aware of it and you agree. The third item regarding the rent is How is it paid? Is it going to be paid by checks? Is it going to be paid by transfer? Is it paid every month? Is it paid every 3 months? All of those things are important. One thing that's important to realize also is that you will more often than not in leases in Israel see that the rent is paid by a series of post-dated checks, which you have to give at the start of the contract period. Meaning at the contract signing, if it's a 12-month lease, you give 12 post-dated checks. Outside of Israel, people hardly even use checks today, so it strikes people as archaic, annoying, and outdated. But it's important to realize that this is a method of protection in Israel, of security, because it is illegal to just cancel a check. Therefore, checks serve as a protection for the landlord that the rent will be paid. If the check bounces, the check can be taken to a special collections court and submitted for collection. I'll get to that more when I get to the section on securities. So also on the rent, as I said, when is it being paid? Monthly, bi-monthly, every quarter. Sometimes people can get a break on the rent if they pay the whole thing in advance. All of those things come on the business terms. Then we've got the lease period, the exact dates, okay? Not just 12 months, it starts on this date and ends on that date. The next thing that's important regarding dates is the option. If you ever follow any of the Facebook groups like Living Financially in Israel or any of the Nefesh B'Nefesh Olim groups, you will see a lot of questions about what is the automatic option according to the law for rental contracts. Here's the real answer. There is no automatic option for extensions in rental contracts in Israel. Unless it is written in your contract, you do not automatically have the right to extend that contract. Not only that, but it has to be a specific option and an option in your favor as the tenant, meaning the option must say the tenant has the right to extend the contract for a period of 1 year or 2 years at the same rent or at X rent, which is, you know, a small increase. If the option says the parties may agree to extend the rent at a rent which will be decided in the future, that option is not worth anything because obviously the landlord can come up with fantastical terms that would not be amenable to you and your option would not mean anything. So you need to make sure that your option is specified and with which terms you specifically would have the one-sided option to extend that contract. Similarly, many people also assume that there is an automatic right to end a contract early with a certain notice period. Not true. According to the law in Israel, there is no automatic out clause in a rental contract. And therefore, if you would like to have the option to end your contract early, it must state so specifically in your contract. Standard is 2, 3, 4 months advance notice. Sometimes landlords are not willing to give you an out clause at all. One thing that's important to realize is that out clauses are generally mutual. And therefore, if it's important to you to make sure that you have this out clause because perhaps you're thinking you'll buy something or perhaps you're not sure you'd like to stay in that area, you have to realize that generally they're mutual. And that means you run the risk of your landlord ending the lease early, sometimes during a season, the middle of the year when it's difficult to find another apartment. So you have to weigh that risk against the benefit of having an out clause on your side. Subletting. There is no automatic right to sublet your apartment in Israel. So if you sign a contract and all of a sudden you decide you'd really like to go live in a different city, you're not necessarily going to be able to just find a replacement tenant. The contract has to allow for it. And in any case, all sublets are always subject to the approval of the landlord who doesn't just want anyone coming and living in his or her apartment. So therefore, if you think that every summer you go home, God willing, we would all be able to travel one day. You go back to America because you're a teacher and you teach something there, or you go see your family and you'd like to make sure that you can rent that apartment out for that period of time, you need to make sure it's in your contract. The same idea for replacement tenants. We see this a lot, especially with younger Olim or students. They want to make sure that if they change their mind or they get married or even if people buy an apartment, that they're able to bring in another tenant to replace themselves. That needs to be in your contract. Moving on. The next segment of elements in any contract are the maintenance and repairs. This is one of the biggest areas that people call me up with problems with their landlords, and often it's because it wasn't properly worded or negotiated in their contract. Now something's come up and it's not clear at all who has to pay for it. So first of all, the repairs. The repairs, according to the law, are the landlord's responsibility for things which are not considered low-cost repairs. According to the law, the landlord cannot fob off on a tenant major repairs to a property. They also cannot force you to take out the structural insurance on the apartment instead of the landlord. But a lot of people don't know that. So they will sign a contract that says all the repairs for the apartment are on the tenant. That is not what your contract should say. Your contract should say that the landlord is responsible for the major repairs to the apartment, except for things that are either low-cost repairs, for instance, perhaps fixing a leaky sink, or things which were caused by the negligence or unreasonable use by the tenant. So to go down our list over here, we have, first of all, your contract should state what the status of the apartment is when you start the contract. What is the best way for you to set that out? The best way is for you to do a written protocol together with the landlord when you get the keys. This doesn't mean that you're putting onto the landlord an obligation to repair every little thing in the apartment, but it's good to set a baseline. Oftentimes you're going to be in that apartment for 2, 3, even 4 years. 4 years down the line, they come to you and they say, the kitchen counter is cracked. We want you to pay for that damage. And you'll say, but I got it with the kitchen counter cracked. How would you know? The best thing to do is to do a written protocol. Even take pictures is what I recommend. Then you send it to the landlord and everybody has a reference that you can look at. So you do a written protocol together with your landlord. Again, the basic premise in any contract is that you are responsible for any repairs which are caused by your negligence or by unreasonable use. And the landlord is responsible for any repairs which are caused through normal wear and tear. Normal wear and tear is generally a pretty well accepted definition. It can be a little bit gray, but clearly if you have a child who put their, in a fit of anger, their hand through a door, that's not normal wear and tear. But if the paint gets scratched up a little bit, that is normal wear and tear. Low-cost repairs also are generally things that are a couple hundred shekels, things that you can do yourself. And that's the idea, that you would only be really on the hook for things that are small repairs. One of the biggest items that we see, a question on who should pay for it, are appliances and air conditioning. Many times, as I referenced in the earlier slide, landlords will include appliances in the contents list, but then will suddenly say, but I'm not responsible for the repairs. According to the law, they are allowed to do that, meaning that this is already not the apartment, it's a specific furnishing, and you will have to decide whether or not you're willing to take on the repairs for those appliances. Air conditioning should not be included in that. I view air conditioning as part and parcel of the apartment, but it's very important to specify that air conditioning is included in the description of the apartment. And as long as you're doing normal maintenance on that air conditioning, like cleaning the filters, if it breaks, the landlord needs to fix it. But again, I really recommend that you specify it in your contract. I must see a few questions a year just on this topic. Okay, maintenance. Again, everyday maintenance, ongoing maintenance is your responsibility as a tenant. You need to clean the filters. You need to make sure that the hair is not clogging the drain, that wipes are not being flushed down the toilet, all those kinds of things. Because if you're not doing normal maintenance, then it's not considered reasonable use of the apartment, and you could be liable for much bigger repairs. If you happen to be renting a property with a garden, it's also important to discuss who is responsible for the garden maintenance. In general, you have to maintain the garden, but you should also, on your protocol, going through the apartment and setting out what the state of the apartment is at the start of the lease, you should also write down, what does the garden look like? And take some pictures, because it's not reasonable for the landlord to expect to get it back beautiful and planted if you got in and it was kind of a patch of dirt. So you should set out what the baseline also is for the garden. Landlord's visits. This is a clause you will see in every contract, that the landlord has the right to come and check up on you. Now, there are a few things you can do in the contract to balance this clause. One of them is to, for sure, make sure that the clause states that the landlord has to give you advance notice. Try for 48 hours. 24 hours is a must, and it must be coordinated with you. You don't want them just surprise knocking at your door. The other item is that you want to put into the contract that all landlord visits must be in your presence, because you don't want people going through your house when you're not home, or just using their key and going into your house. So both of those things should be written in regarding landlord's visits. When you're vacating the house, you're kind of doing the whole process in reverse. Now you're going to do a second walkthrough. Make sure that the house is indeed in the same state that it was when you got it, subject to normal wear and tear. Do you have to patch and or paint? This is something that should be stated in your contract. The general rule is that if you get the apartment nicely, freshly painted, you should expect to have to freshly paint the apartment when you're giving it back. If you got it not painted, you should be allowed to give it back also not painted. So again, it's something to make sure that it's stated in your contract. Don't leave this to common sense or something that seems obvious to everyone. It's not. It needs to be stated in your contract whether or not you're obligated to paint. Additionally, cleaning is something that we also see. The landlord in his mind gave it to you perfectly clean and thinks that you're giving it back perfectly unclean. It's very important also to write down and take pictures on your original protocol what the state of the cleanliness was when you received the apartment. Additional costs. Okay. In addition to your rent, what should you expect to pay for when you're renting an apartment? One is utilities. All the utilities, connected with the usage are in addition to the rent, unless it states that the rent includes water or something like that. But that's very, very unusual in Israel. And 99% of the time, all utility costs will be in addition to the rent. That's water, gas, electricity, if you have cable, internet, all those things are your own costs. The next thing on the list is something called Vad Bayit, which is kind of like the co-op fees or the building management fees or a management company. In the nicer buildings or the newer buildings, you'll more often than not see a management company. This generally is more expensive than Vad Bayit. Vad Bayit is generally in the older buildings where you'd see maybe 6, 8, 10 apartments, and it covers insurance on the elevator if they have one, cleaning the stairwells, and maybe doing the landscaping of the common areas. It's generally a couple hundred shekels a month, 200, 300, 400 shekels maybe. When you get into the bigger buildings, especially the high rises, you'll see a management company because there's a lot more facilities. The more facilities a building has, the more it will cost you in management fees. So you may be renting in a nicer building, in a newer building that's got a gym or maybe a pool, bigger lobbies, 2 or 3 elevators. All of that will translate into a higher monthly management fee, which is yours to pay as the tenant. So it's always important to ask, what is the Vad Bayit, or what is the Dmei Nihul, or the management fees? And that should come into your equation as to how much the rent is. The next cost on your list is Arnona. Arnona is a yearly property tax, which is paid in bi-monthly installments in Israel. This tax is paid by whoever is actually using the property. So if you are the tenant, it is your tax. As an Ole, you get a discount for up to, I think it's around 100 meters for 12 months of your first within the period of your first 2 years of Aliyah. So you get a small discount for a 12-month period, but after that, it's your tax. There are other discounts you can get. Senior citizen has a discount, and sometimes students if you have low income, but that's on a case-to-case basis. But it's important also to be asking the agent or the landlord, how much is the Arnona for the apartment, so you can also put it into your cost equation. Any other taxes related to use, gardener, exterminator, all those kinds of things, anything that comes into usage costs are all paid by the tenant. Insurance costs. I mentioned earlier on that according to the law, the landlord cannot ask you to pay the structural insurance. I'm having trouble saying that today. But that doesn't mean that there aren't any other insurance costs for you as a tenant. One insurance cost that you should expect to pay is third-party insurance, which generally includes fire. That means that someone comes to clean for you, or you have a party or a visitor and they fall, they can sue your insurance company, and you want to make sure that you have insurance. When I represent landlords, we always make sure that tenants carry third-party and fire insurance. If you have contents, it will be your own responsibility to insure your contents. Again, I recommend it. Those two things can go together. It's not expensive, and replacing the entire contents of your apartment, should there be a flood or even smoke damage, even if it's not all destroyed in a fire, can be very expensive. Okay, going to the end of the lease. I touched on these when I was talking about vacating and maintenance, but it's also important to keep in mind that there can be costs associated with vacating the apartment. If you have to do any repairs, if you have to paint, depending on what you've negotiated in your contract, and if you have to clean the apartment. Sometimes if you've received it professionally cleaned, they will expect to receive it back in the same condition, and you should bear in mind that that will carry an additional cost for you. Securities. Securities is perhaps the biggest difference between rental agreements in Israel and rental agreements outside of Israel, especially the United States. The United States, it's very common, first and last month's rent, they give you the keys, and that's it. That is not the way it works in Israel. Again, every apartment is individually owned. It is very difficult to evict a delinquent tenant in Israel. It's a court process that can take a minimum of up to 6 months if someone stops paying the rent and doesn't move out. And you can't go in and turn off the utilities or, throw out their stuff. I know that now many places outside of Israel, you can't do that kind of thing anyway either, but in Israel, you for sure can't do it. And it's a long and arduous process. For that reason, you would expect to be seeing securities that are covering probably 6 months of rent in various forms. So I'm going to go through them. Not all of them are cash. The law places a cap on how much securities can be requested in cash, but it doesn't mean that the landlords are not making use of other tools at their disposal. So there are a few types of securities. One is a guarantor. A guarantor is left over from, it's kind of an older tactic used in Israel, but it's still used today. It's definitely something that outside of Israel, you don't see it. English-speaking Olim find it especially chafing and irritating, as though as a responsible adult, they need someone to come in and sign for them. But you will more than likely be asked for a guarantor, especially as an Ole who has no family financial history and sometimes no employment in Israel when you come in. Landlords get very antsy about renting to someone who has no ties yet to the country. And therefore, they often ask for a guarantor. So a guarantor has to be someone in Israel, over 18, with proven financial ability to guarantee your financial obligations under the lease. A lot of times they will ask for 2. We always try to negotiate it down to at least 1. Is it a limited or an unlimited guarantee? Most of the time they'll say that they want, as a landlord, they want the guarantor to guarantee all of the obligations of a tenant under the lease. But sometimes we can negotiate that it would be limited to a certain amount of money. It's also important to realize that if you have an option period in your lease, that the guarantors are usually required to also guarantee the option period. So guarantors is one option. The next that we'll see are checks. Sometimes beyond the post-dated rent checks, which I touched on earlier, which form a basis of security for the landlord. They will also ask you to give you a security check, or also other checks made out to the utilities with no date and no amount, made out to the water company and made out to the electricity company. You would expect to see these as a security for unpaid bills. Because again, the securities in Israel are going to protect the landlord from 3 categories of risk. 1 is damage to the apartment, 2 is unpaid rent, and 3 is unpaid bills, unpaid utilities. So that is why they're trying to cover their bases in all these different ways. As far as a deposit, there are a few options for an actual deposit besides the guarantor or the post-dated checks. One is a bank guarantee. This means that you actually have to put the money into your bank account and lock that sum of money up for the period of the contract, usually plus a month or two to make sure that all of the bills are paid for the benefit of the landlord. And if you breach the contract, he can go in and claim the money. Or a cash guarantee, a cash deposit. Both of these two types of securities, which entail you as a tenant putting up an actual amount of cash, are limited to 3 months rent, meaning if you're renting something for 5,000 shekels, they cannot ask you for a bank guarantee or a cash deposit of more than 15,000 shekel. It doesn't, however, prevent them from putting that together with some of the other options, meaning a landlord is allowed to ask you for up to 3 months cash, plus post-dated checks, plus a guarantor. Some of the other options, if we don't want to put up cash, which is always our objective as a tenant, is to offer either a security check known as an open check, meaning you're making it out to the landlord with a set amount, but with no date. Why no date, by the way, on all of these checks? Because checks in Israel are only good for 6 months. After 6 months, they automatically are no good. And therefore, you never put a date that's more than 6 months in advance, because otherwise it would be useless to the landlord. So they leave it with no date, and then they can fill in the date if need be, if you've breached the contract and they need to utilize those checks. The third option, besides checks and I think I'm on the fourth option, a bank guaranteed cash open check, is something called a promissory note, shtar chov. It's like a check, meaning that it's not money that you have to put up. It's really an IOU, but it's used because it has a place on it for a guarantor to sign. So you will often see a shtar chov used when there is also a guarantor required, because the guarantor then, in addition to you, can sign this promissory note, can sign this shtar chov. So here, that's the gamut of securities. And you're always trying to negotiate a combination that is the least amount of money that you have to put up. When I'm representing, obviously, a landlord, I like to get as much cash as we can, because it gives us the most flexibility if someone doesn't make good on the lease, and we don't have to go to court, we don't have to go to any of the other forums. But when I'm representing a tenant, I obviously want to limit their exposure to someone having cash in their hand, or for them having to come up with even more cash. Aliyah is already a hard enough process as it is, and we like to not have to lay out any more cash than possible. So what you would be looking for as a tenant is to try to give perhaps a check, or maybe 1 month cash and a check, and try to stay away from the guarantors if possible. But at least 50% of the leases that I do utilize guarantors. None of these are crazy, but what you're definitely going to make sure is that you're not giving a bank guarantee or cash that's more than 3 months rent. Okay. Legal recourse. First of all, you have to know your rights. You have to know, again, which things that you're allowed to be asked to repair, which I touched on, and which things are not your responsibility no matter what. The landlord cannot ask you to be doing capital repairs on his property. The landlord must repair things that prevent reasonable use in your apartment. There's no electricity, that is not considered a livable apartment, and he is not allowed to be renting it to you at that point. There is legal recourse for that. If you have a valid lease and the landlord sells the apartment, the sale is subject to the lease. So the new buyer has to honor the lease unless there's an out clause in the contract. How do you get your deposit back? You have to make sure in the contract that it says during what time frame the landlord has to return your deposit. The landlord has rights as well. If you don't pay, or there's non-payment, or you've made or you've caused a lot of damage, they can sue you. There is also the possibility of being evicted if you don't pay the rent. It just takes time. So there is legal recourse. It's not completely a wild, wild west. But what we as attorneys always advocate is to try to not get into those situations. You want it to be completely clear in your lease what your obligations are, what the landlord's obligations are, and have to stay out of suing or going to court or any of those things. And the clearer your lease is, the more you'll be able to avoid those kinds of misunderstandings. Illegal clauses that you would be looking for in any lease. Again, anytime you see a clause in a lease that says that if you do not pay the rent, the landlord can come in, change the locks, throw out your things into the street, that's an illegal clause. That is not allowed according to the law. So that should be omitted from your lease. How they are allowed to use your deposit. In any lease, you should make sure that they have to give you written notice of their intent to use the deposit so that you have time to cure the breach. A lot of times there's a misunderstanding. For instance, your check bounced, but you didn't realize it. Or there was some damage and you didn't realize it. You should be given the opportunity to cure that breach before they go and either cash your check or claim the bank guarantee or anything like that. And again, if you see a clause in your contract that they're asking for more than 3 months rent as a cash deposit, that is illegal according to the law. Okay, so at this point, that is my overall presentation. Let me see if there are any questions. Okay. Oh, a long-term lease. Okay, in general, there are not long-term leases. You can do a lease with 5 to 10 years, but again, you would be expected to be seeing that rent linked to the index or with regular increases. Again, there's no law in Israel which limits the rent increase. I must get that question once a month from Olim. There is no law in Israel which limits the rent increase. Therefore, if you have a long-term lease and you want to be able to stay there, or you have an option, you must state in your contract specifically how much the rent increases will be. No more, recommended is no more than 5% every 2 years, but again, it's subjective. Leases longer than 5 years are very uncommon in Israel, mostly because landlords don't want to be boxed in and not be able to sell the apartment. Yes, post-dated checks. If they don't want to give you back your checks, they are good only for 6 months. But if the landlord shows that you bounce the check, there's a special collections court for checks known as Hotzat Lefal, and they can put in your check and enforce it against you. So you don't want to be canceling checks. Another question I see is about guarantors. If you do not have family in Israel, who could be used as your guarantor? It's a really, really good question. And this is one of the challenges that Olim face. It's uncomfortable to ask a friend. And so what we generally do as attorneys representing Olim is that we try to negotiate something else besides a guarantor. If you have no guarantor, you could expect to have to put down the full or likely closer to the full amount of cash that's allowed because they need to be able to make sure that, that they've basically got something on you, that there's something holding you, or that they have some sort of recourse if you don't pay the rent. Regarding the security, another question, does the lawyer hold the security deposit in escrow? About 50-50. It depends on who the lawyer is for the landlord. Not all landlords use lawyers. I hold many deposits for my clients, especially if it's checks. I put it in the file or a shtar chov if it's a promissory note. But a lot of times the landlord won't agree to that and they'll hold it themselves. I agree, and it's always recommended to try to have the escrow amount or the security held by an attorney. I will go on to a few more questions. Josh, you can jump in and tell me when we should stop. Right now, it seems like we've got a bit more time. Can the rent be in dollars or shekels? It is legal to do rent in dollars. It's legal to pay rent outside of Israel. We do have that. So none of that is a problem. If you and the landlord both prefer to do your business in dollars, that is legal. Can I talk more about rentals not having appliances? Some said you have to buy them yourself, but ovens and stoves usually fit specific spaces, and you have to buy them and move them around yourself. So yes, they do have to fit specific spaces, but in general in Israel, there are a couple of standard sizes. There's not such a gamut of sizes. And it kind of depends. If it's a space where there's a space for what's like a freestanding oven, then you might see that those aren't included. If it's built in, it's like laid into the countertop, or the oven is built in, you will generally see that that it's included, and then it becomes a question of who's paying for the repairs. Sometimes people buy them and then they'll move them to their next apartment, especially people that keep kosher. They're not always relying on previously used appliances, and so they don't really have a problem. Sometimes there are even appliances which are included, and the tenants will ask them to be stored and bring in their own appliances, or sometimes they buy them and they sell them afterwards. It's just it's a subjective point. The checks for the utility bills are given to the landlord or paid straight to the utility? That's a good question. In general, how it works is that you as the tenant transfer all the bills to your name. This is a protection for you, because what happens is when you move in is you read the meter and you call up whatever the electricity utility company is, and you start the bill from that point on your name. So you're not paying for previous usage, and you're only paying from that meter reading forward. Similarly, you also put the contract with the municipality for the Arnona, or the monthly property tax that I mentioned. You also put that into your name. And that also protects you if the previous tenant didn't pay their bill, or if you get a discount because you're an ole, or you have a different set of circumstances which make you eligible for a discount. You have to have it registered in your name in order to get that discount. Okay. Can you address renting to seniors? Anything to know in particular? There's a mortgage question. Mortgage questions are being handled in the purchasing seminar, so you can go back and listen to that, or we can give you the number of the mortgage broker. But renting to seniors, the only thing that's specific regarding seniors is you are eligible oftentimes for a discount on the property tax. And also it's important to try to get a longer term lease, and without the landlord really having an option to throw you out, because it's difficult, especially seniors, to have to start looking for an apartment like, in January, which isn't really the season. Interesting for seniors sometimes is to put into your lease that if, in case you need to change your living conditions because of, God forbid, a disability or a change in your health, that you would be able to get out of the lease, say, with 3 months notice. So that's sometimes an important thing to put into your lease as a senior citizen, the ability to leave the lease in certain circumstances. Is the estate or family responsible after the decease of the signor? I'm assuming that you mean the landlord. Yes. Again, the lease rights, your rights as a tenant under a lease survive even if the landlord passes away, and they would have to honor your lease. If you plan to make Aliyah in July of 2021, when should you be looking for an apartment? Really good apartment time to look at, and this is an agent question, but I'll tell you from my experience, is after Pesach. That's when a lot of things come up. And again, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to time it exactly. You might have to pay an extra month or something to secure the apartment that you want, especially in certain areas. For instance, I personally live in Modi'in, and there's certain areas of Modi'in where they just go like hotcakes, and you just want to rent it as soon as you can. And there's other areas that, there's a lot more coming up, or there's a lot more of a rotating stock, and you wouldn't necessarily have to rent it so early. Okay. If you have to give an undated check for the security, how do you ensure you get it back at the end of the lease from the landlord if you can't stop a check in Israel? So that's part of the, when you're giving back the keys to him, you would make him give you back the securities. And again, you would have claim against him in court, but generally what they do is they tear the check. I've almost never had a landlord which suddenly is using a security check at the end of the lease. And then you can, you would also have recourse against someone that's using a check if you can show that you paid all the rent. Are the leases usually in both Hebrew and English, or just Hebrew? I do leases in both Hebrew and English, but not both together in the same lease. So in general, the leases are in Hebrew. It's legal to do a lease in English if both parties understand English, but you never want to have a lease that's bilingual or duolingual, because one of them will be slightly different, and then it's always a question of which one is binding. So you want to pick one language and have the lease in that language. Okay, how is renting dealt with during Corona as you need to go into quarantine and you start off in the Airbnb? You basically pay the extra rent while you go into quarantine. There's not a really good solution for the Corona. If you can time it exactly that, it starts after you get out of quarantine, more power to you. But again, there's going to be a little bit of overlap.
Well, Jane, can I just add in there?
Yeah.
We have, throughout this entire time since March, Aliyah has never stopped. There's been quarantine since that time, and doesn't look like it's going away anytime too soon. But we've had many Olim move straight into their rental apartments. There's no inherent need to move into an Airbnb. It's probably not a Corona hotel, which we try to advise against as much as possible. It's not a given that you can time everything up, but I would say the vast majority of Olim over the last 6 to 8 months have moved directly into their permanent, semi-permanent, whatever their first home in Israel, without stopping in a Airbnb or a Corona hotel.
Okay. Can I go on? So
Yeah,
someone just asked me how to find a good lawyer. Well, luckily there are two of them helping you out tonight. So either myself, I'm an attorney for 20 years. This is my specialization. Or Yair Givati is also specializes in real estate law. I posted there on the question both of our emails. Feel free to write us. We review a lot of leases every year, especially starting in the springtime, which is what we call lease season, but all year round we have leases, and I'm happy to help you, or Yair's happy to help you. So definitely, please turn to us. Now, the Arnona is different. How does the property tax work? Okay, the property tax is based on a zone, and it's also based on the size of the apartment. So there is a way to look up by municipality how much the property tax is. Inherently, the fancier, more upscale areas of Israel have a higher property tax. So you should really be asking the landlord or the agent for a copy of the Arnona bill so that you can see how much the Arnona is. Is it likely that what about replacing locks? In general, you may ask them to replace the locks, and it can happen. A lot of times what happens is the tenants replace the locks, but then they have to give the landlord at least one copy of the key. That's not a bad idea, especially considering that who knows how many people before you have had the same key. What are the typical issues an Olim comes across in renting? So again, the biggest problem is the securities. I have people get very upset with me that, they've owned 50 houses and they're professionals, and why do they have to bring a guarantor, and the securities are ridiculous, and all of that kind of stuff. It makes people feel very violated, like they're viewed as not trustworthy. So going back to our original tips of leaving those expectations behind, if you can view it from the point of the landlord is giving you use of a property which is very valuable and has a lot of difficulty in getting you out. If you turned out to not pay the rent, you can see why they take a lot of securities, and that's kind of the viewpoint where it's coming from. So try not to chafe personally when you're asked for a lot of securities, and let's just try to negotiate it to something that you can live with. Okay, why is the tenant responsible for an exterminator? That's kind of an interesting question. It's gray. If it's a problem in the entire building, then yes, you would want to get the building to do the exterminating, and ostensibly that would be covered by either your vad bayit, your co-op fees, or the management fees. Sometimes though, you've rented a house and they have an ant problem. So it can be something that can be addressed in your contract. Most of the time what happens is the landlord will give you the house, maybe having had the extermination done, and then if you live there, it would be your responsibility to keep it up. If the renter dies, that is a good question. It's not really covered in the contract, but in general, from my experience of 20 years, if the renter dies, the family pays the rent until they find a new tenant. You get an agent to bring in a new tenant. Most of the time, the landlord is a mensch, and after, you know, he'll find a new tenant, and once he does, then he'll let you out of the contract. Should you find a rent, and it doesn't matter if your attorney's in the immediate area. It does not matter if your attorney is in a lot and you're renting in Svat. None of these issues are locale specific. All of the issues are standard for all of the leases that we see. It doesn't matter to me what property you're renting on, meaning what area. I ask you what you're expecting to see in the lease, what things you've agreed, then I make sure that it reflects that. You definitely want to make sure that your attorney is summarizing the basic terms of the contract, pointing out to you any extra money, pointing out to you any specific things that you need to know. But no, you can use an attorney that you trust for anywhere in the country. If the rent includes the VAD and the Arnona. Okay, one thing that I want to point out with my last few minutes is if you see a contract and all of a sudden all of the utilities and everything is included, oftentimes that will point out to you that the apartment has been illegally split into two, meaning that it was one large property and now it's split into two, and they're giving you kind of an all-inclusive price. That's not necessarily a bad thing, except that you have to realize that it's very difficult then for you to measure your exact usage of those utilities, and that you can't put the bills on your name because there isn't a separate meter. So bear it in mind if you start seeing an all-inclusive price, that generally it means that it's not legally meant to be its own unit. What should one expect to use on a lawyer to look, maybe to pay? Paying a lawyer is anywhere between half a month's rent and a month's rent plus VAT. And you also expect to pay an agent to find you an apartment. If you use that, 1 month's rent plus VAT. I am suggesting renting before you arrive. How do you rent place unseen? Okay. Oh, how do you rent before you make Aliyah? This is a really good question. First of all, a lot of agents do pretty good video tours, or you have a trusted friend go to see it for you. I'm not suggesting that you rent before you come, only it depends on what area you want to be in. If there's low stock or you have specific dates, then sometimes you have no choice. And how to work out the checks is generally we negotiate and we say, okay, we're going to send now 2 or 3 months rent by wire, and you have so much time to come up with the checks, or you have a friend or a relative that puts in the checks temporarily, and you're allowed to swap them out, say 45 days after you make Aliyah, which allows you time to open an account, quarantine first, open an account, and then get checks. So we're used to it, and we'll help you. Okay, I think we're done. Please feel free to email us. I'm sure that our email information is being shared somewhere. Short-term rentals, I saw a question there. Short-term rentals are a different kettle of fish. You want to be looking online for short-term rental areas, and then and that's like a small, kind of a more reduced contract. So somewhere there's going to be our emails, and any other questions that you have that didn't get answered, please feel free to send to myself or to Yair by email. And we've been doing this for a lot of years. We're used to the questions, and we're happy to help you.
Thank you, Jane, very much. Thank you, Yair. This was very, very helpful and thorough. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Again, this has been recorded. We will be sending it out in the next 24 to 48 hours, along with all contact information, some of the resources that were shared here as well, and a copy of the presentation itself. Thank you very much, and have a great day.